Hi, I'm Tamron, and welcome to this training on how to pivot in the time of Corona. It's really a training about Corona resilience, and I've put it together because no matter where you are right now in your Airbnb business or your short-term rental business, we're faced with a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience that we're having here, which is how to adapt and how to make sure that we keep a revenue stream going if we are in short-term rental and specifically Airbnb. So I have a platform called B&B Made Easy or Airbnb Made Easy, and this training is specifically for my students who are either in my Airbnb starter kit program, so people who are just starting out and managing one space perhaps in their own house, and for my Airbnb Empire students who use the rent-to-rent model, so the rental arbitrage model of renting spaces and listing them on Airbnb. And in fact, right now, I'm in the middle of my Success Live program, which is the 12-week live program, taking people right from the beginning through my 5-step methodology to be able to have successful Airbnb business. But I've interrupted that in order to give you this Corona resilience module, so that I can share with you some ideas around what we can do in the face of what we're experiencing. And let's then jump in talking about what we're experiencing. You know, we're facing a very unique time at the moment. Depending on when you're watching this, a couple of weeks ago, this is filmed late March, a couple of weeks ago, the USA closed its borders to travelers from Europe. If you're watching this from South Africa, I'm broadcasting from South Africa. Just last night, our president closed borders to any non-citizens coming from high-risk countries and recommended minimizing domestic travel. And all of these could have really serious consequences if we aren't willing to take the lead in our businesses and to pivot and to adapt. Other factors, which are the second point there, is a phenomenon called social distancing. So social distancing is not the same as quarantine. It is the practice of keeping your social interaction to a minimum. So leaving the house as little as possible. If you can adjust and work from home, to do that. And really the purpose of social distancing is to allow the flattening of the spread of the coronavirus so that the healthcare systems around the world can have a chance to cope because of the limited number of facilities available in the literal sense of ICU and ventilators, etc. So the idea of social distancing is an individual taking their personal responsibility and doing their best to not spread the virus, even if they're not in a high-risk category themselves. And then to the third point there, self-isolation, there are people who are taking social distancing to a very serious extent of choosing to completely self-isolate themselves, kind of hunker down in a space, store things that they're going to need for a period of time, and to make sure that they're doing almost no social interaction or leaving of the house. And then there's quarantine, which is the fourth point on the list there. And quarantine is the recommendation of some governments that if you have traveled to a high-risk area, or if you've done any travel, then you need to go into a quarantine, a self-quarantine, where you don't have any interaction with anyone for up to 14 days. And then there, of course, could be a government quarantine where there's institutions. We recently had a plane of over 100 people land in South Africa from China, which have gone into official quarantine in a lodge, in a ranch. So this brings up very interesting conversations that I want to have with you on this training. And in light of the Airbnb recently extending their extenuating circumstances policy and offering a full refund to the guest, both of the Airbnb portion and the guest's portion. So that leaves us with an opportunity to really get creative in the face of us not knowing exactly how long this coronavirus epidemic will be around. I've seen that some governments are anticipating, an 8-week period, and I've heard some specialists, some virologists, some experts in infectious diseases telling us that we could expect up to a 7-month corona winter, that it's not necessarily going to blow over in the space of weeks. So with that in mind, I really want us to now, in a very collaborative way, if you've got any questions, you can put them in the comments. I can see what you're writing. I really want to explore our options based on my experience in what I'm doing in my business, what my students are doing in the interaction I've had with them, and what other very experienced hosts are doing in the communities that I'm plugged into. So that's really what we're going to do now, is we're going to take a look at what our options are. But first and foremost, it's very important that we realize that the foundation of taking any action now is going to be about adapting and pivoting, particularly if your primary business is your short-term rental business, or you have multiple properties and you've got overheads that you need to cover and staff that you need to pay. You really have an opportunity now to take the lead and to adapt and pivot. So I want to talk about companies in the past that have used this concept of pivoting. Pivoting meaning to see what's happening, to respond to it, and to change direction. And a very famous example of a company pivoting in the past is Nokia. Absolutely, it's unfortunate that its last pivot it didn't make, but that doesn't make it not worth talking about. Nokia, some of you might be surprised to discover, way back when, over in the 1800s, over 100 years ago, was a wood pulp mill on a river that begins with the sound Nokia something in Scandinavia, which is how the name came about. And depending on what has happened throughout the course of history for Nokia up until the kind of mid-teen 2000s, it decided to read the market and adjust its product or its offering in response to what was happening in the world around them. And what that led to was them ultimately becoming dominant in the cell phone market. But had they not read what was happening in the current times, they would have gone bankrupt probably in the 1800s. Unfortunately, as I said, they could have done with a large and final pivot, because they're no longer a huge name in the cell phone brand. But that in and of itself is a perfect example of how, as a business owner, we always have to be looking for opportunities on how we're going to pivot. Another example, a fantastic example of a company pivoting in the past is Suzuki. Suzuki is a company named after a person who originally used to make looms. So loom meaning a machine, kind of a weaving machine I think also this was in the early 1900s, and saw an opportunity, wanted to pivot in their business, and pivoted into cars, and then also into motorbikes, which perhaps they've become the most famous for. And it's interesting how the pivot that you can see in companies over history don't necessarily even have to be related to what they initially started. I mean, what does a paper mill have to do with a cell phone, and what does a car have to do with a loom, with a kind of a weaving machine? And just the last example I want to share, and there are hundreds of examples. If you want some inspiration, just Google examples of companies that have pivoted or entrepreneurs that have pivoted, and you'll find plenty. But here's just a final one of Instagram, which started out as an app that had nothing to do with what it is today, and the journey that the founders took in order to pivot. Now, you might be thinking to me, oh, okay, come on, like how realistic is that? You're showing me examples of huge companies, and I'm sitting with my one Airbnb or my two Airbnbs or my three Airbnbs, or I'm right at the beginning of my Airbnb journey, and you're talking to me about making huge pivots in this time, which may be a major recession. Like, what is actually going to be happening in our world? And I want to share then just a list of companies that were all founded in a recession. In fact, I came across a statistic when I was doing research for this module for you, that up to 50% of the Fortune 500 companies are companies that were founded during a recession. So I want to really just present a silver lining thinking to you, that there could be an incredible opportunity for you just to allow yourself to think about what pivoting could mean for you and what path could open up for you right now, while we're all having to be super resilient in our businesses. So just to bring to a close what the idea of a pivot means, it means to be prepared to change direction if necessary in response to what is happening around us, even if that means a different direction than you might have initially intended. So where does that leave us then? So how do we pivot? Okay, great. I understand it's important, but what does that actually mean? So it means that we have to assess how our current assets can add value in the current times. And obviously, if you are an Airbnb business owner or somebody who has access to spaces, your current assets, your current spaces could be adding value to what is needed now. So what may be needed now, I've put together a list of things that could be needed depending on where you are in the world, either right now or in a very short space of time. And I'd really like to open this to the floor at the end for you to participate in the comments if you have any other suggestions that you'd like to share. So right now, based on what people are doing, spaces are still in demand. They're just in demand for a different sense. People are wanting to self-isolate at the moment. Now, remember, there's a difference between quarantine, self-isolate, and social distancing. And I want you to consider if your space is appropriate perhaps for all three. And I am by no means recommending that you do anything that puts yourself or your family or any of your community members at risk. But if you consider that self-isolating does not mean necessarily that somebody's sick, or social distancing doesn't mean that somebody's sick, it's just people taking precaution to prevent the spread of the disease, it is really possible that your space could be ideal to change its purpose right now. So what do we need spaces for right now? We certainly notice that people are wanting to self-isolate. We know that there are travelers stranded all over the world right now because of travel bans. So they perhaps can't or don't want to return to their country of origin because they don't want to take the chance of infecting their peers or their family members. And that is really an opportunity right now. So we know that travelers are potentially stranded and that they need a place to stay, maybe even in the long term, because they don't want to return and endanger people around them, or they are not allowed to return. We also know that there are demands for official spaces for quarantine. I might have mentioned that a South African airplane landed in South Africa recently with over 100 passengers who needed to go into official government quarantine, and they have been quarantined in a ranch, in a lodge that accommodates that volume of people. So there is a demand for spaces that lend themselves to official quarantine. The ranch that they are being quarantined that is fairly isolated. It's not a densely populated area, and depending on what spaces you have access to, perhaps your space lends itself to even an official quarantine area. We also need spaces that are quiet for people to be able to work in isolation. And now I'm using the sense isolation in that you're not going to be disturbed. As you would have seen, a lot of schools have closed. A lot of people are being encouraged to work from home. And if you have children and you need to work from home, that's very unlikely that you're going to be able to be productive. So people who can't go to the office because they don't want to interact with people, they're trying to practice social distancing, but they can't stay at home because they've got kids, may be looking for a quiet place to work, just like they would do if they went to a cafe or they went to a co-working space. But now those options are suddenly taken away if it has been declared unsafe to go to a mall or go to a busy space. I mean, as I mentioned, one of the restrictions put in place by the South African government is no gatherings of 100 people or more. Now, what the definition of that is, I'm not quite sure. It might mean you can't go to the gym. It might mean that your office is off bounds. So what that can translate to, as somebody who is the custodian of a space, of an asset that could be used for people to work in, or just one person to work in isolation and quiet to be able to be productive. And then I want to turn it over to you. Any other ideas that you might have had from the collective? I can see there's quite a few of you watching live. Any other ideas you might have had that you've already been wondering about your business? Go ahead and pop it in the comments now. And I will also make both this video available, but also the accompanying text so that you can come back and revise at any point. And if you've had any other ideas of what you thought your space could be used, go ahead and pop it in the comments now, and I'll come back and read them. So with that list in mind, you might be thinking, okay, so I could offer my space as a place for people to work. I could offer my space for people to self-isolate. I could offer my space up for people who are stranded, and any of the other lists that I've suggested. The very next question that might be coming to mind for you is how? How do I get that out there? How do I make that known? So once you've decided what your space is appropriate for, and again, I would like you to act responsibly with making that decision for yourself. Assess what is appropriate for the space that is available to you. If it's appropriate for somebody to work quietly without a high volume of other people around, great. If it's appropriate to offer it up as an official quarantine facility, great. If it's appropriate for people to just self-distance and self-isolate, great. You need to make that decision. And simply what I'm doing here is putting that information out there for you so that you can make an informed choice, or maybe just ignite some of your thinking or spark some of your ideas. So once you have made that decision, you might be thinking, well, where do I start? How do I start letting people know? So what I'm going to do now is jump into a myriad of ways that you can go about making your decision for your change of use of space known. And the very first thing that you can do is use Airbnb itself to make that known. So what I'll do is even then just hop in to Airbnb, into a listing, and show you that you can change your length of stay discounts to whatever it is that you choose. So when you're inside your listing and you go inside of pricing, you can add certain discounts for monthly stays. So if you're wanting to say, okay, great, the way that my change of use of my space is going to be trying to target the people who are perhaps left stranded and they don't know how long they're going to be stranded for, so they're looking for more full-time accommodation. So you're going to offer up to a 50% discount for somebody who books long-term, for example. And of course, what you need to do is make sure that you do your numbers. I do have a template, an Excel template that you can use to pop your expenses in, pop your nightly rate in, pop your occupancy rate, just to make sure what your revenue is going to be. And if you're putting a 50% discount and you're expecting 100% occupancy, and you know that it covers your costs and maybe even gives you some profit, then one of the very first things that you can do is to offer discounts for long-term stays. Because whether somebody is looking for a quiet office to work from, where there aren't going to be any other people going in and out, or whether they're stranded, or whether they want to self-distance or self-isolate, they're likely going to be wanting to reserve your space for a longer term. And since we're in a revenue management mode, you'd much rather have a guest who books your space for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days at something that covers your cost plus, then have it empty and risk the variables. So the very first thing that I recommend that you do is to change your settings on Airbnb itself, particularly if you're one of the hosts who've experienced a high cancellation rate. So as I say, I'm very connected to a lot of very experienced hosts in communities, and we've got WhatsApp groups for the South African host leaders. I'm an official South African host leader for Airbnb, and some of the things that I've seen people in my network saying is that they've experienced 100% cancellation rate for March or April because their guests were primarily from the European base who are no longer allowed to fly. And experiments that I've seen happen within the same day is hosts change their fees to 50% or whatever they've crunched their numbers in it, make sure it's covering their expenses, perhaps with a profit margin. And I literally had one host saying within 5 minutes of doing that, they had 100% occupancy in March again. So that is really the very first step you can take if you want to pivot into a change of use scenario, because there will be people looking for longer term, depending on those different scenarios that we spoke about. Then one of the next things you can do to get that message out there is to go to the neighborhood Facebook group for the community that your space is in. So I've pulled up just an example of a local Facebook community group where the listing that I just showed you is in. And what I could do there is make a post sort of just announcing that my space is available for stranded people, or my space is available if you need to work from home, and just get the message out there. Put the listing link and let people know that this is what you are doing. It's very unlikely that a lot of people are thinking this way, so you will probably quite quickly get some traction if you use that kind of dynamic thinking and then an active effort to get the message out there. So start with neighborhood Facebook groups. Then other ways is perhaps a neighborhood WhatsApp group. I think I even called that example of that up for you. The neighborhood that I live in is called Salt Rock, and there's a very busy community WhatsApp group, which I recommend you find your version of that and you make it known there that you are doing that, whatever the decision is that you decided to pivot and use your space for. Then if you do decide that your space lends itself to people who want to quarantine themselves in an official sense, then do some investigation around it. Personally, I haven't done any investigation around this. My space doesn't lend itself at all to this or any of the spaces that I have access or control over. But what I would do if I had a space that was isolated and lended itself is I would contact perhaps the local testing center or the general practitioner or even the hospital of the area I was in and say, hey, what's going on? What's the need now? How can I add value? Which was the original question that I posed at the beginning of this training. Is the way that you pivot is you look at how you can contribute. And it very well may be the need for one person or two people who need to either self-quarantine or be officially quarantined, and they're looking for a space. And that might be suitable depending on where you are in the world. If you've decided that your space is suitable for people to come and work in the day, and I've mentioned a couple of times in the South African context, that I am in the South African context, and if you are South African or you're aware of some South African challenges, we have rolling power cuts fairly frequently called load shedding, and the space that I showed you earlier has backup power and solar power. And one of the marketing angles that I've used for this space is that it's a space that you can come and work at during a time when there's no electricity in South Africa. And the exact same principle could apply here. You might want to contact your local co-working space and say, look, I know that you've got more than 100 people here, so perhaps this is no longer feasible. If there are people who are looking for a quiet space with good internet and a comfortable place to sit, here is a space. Can I put it on your notice board? Will you share it in your next newsletter to your tenants? Who knows what will come of it, but it is certainly well worth exploring what is happening at your local co-working space, or even your local corporates around you. They might want to rent your space on the long term if they are putting key staff members into their own working spaces. The very same approach could happen if you contacted your local cafes. I work from home, and the only other place I ever work, if I don't work from home, is cafes. I've got favorite cafes that I typically like to go and work at. And during this time of social distancing, I might not be going to those cafes anymore. And if you had a conversation with your local cafe owner, and I recommend that you phone them, I don't recommend that you go there, and say, hey, listen, maybe you've had some regulars who are looking for a place with good internet, and maybe you're close enough that you can still get a coffee from them while they're there. Maybe you're in the same building, who knows? But that might be an option for you. Then, of course, you can get more formal and more distributed in your messaging, whatever your kind of local classified, your local online classifieds are, whether it's Gumtree or Craigslist. You could put a message on there and let people know what your space is being transformed into during this period of time, and make sure that your listing is there. You can go old school and put it in your local newspaper, or if there's a community newspaper, because you never quite know who needs a space now. It might be somebody who's elderly, who's feeling particularly vulnerable, and they might not be on Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups, but they might be reading the newspaper in a frenzy every morning, and you could target that audience by going traditional and putting a formal ad up. Then you could take more extensive advantage and use Instagram. If you don't have an Instagram account yourself, you might have somebody in your network, your daughter, your son, your cousin, your somebody who's active on there, and they might make a post for you to get the news out there. You can put it on your own profile on Facebook, which you have to have if you're watching this Facebook Live training. And your company might have a page, your space might have a page. You can post it on there. And then, of course, you can get quite formal, and you can decide to put an active Facebook ads campaign together. Now, there is a module on how to put a Facebook ad together to promote your listing inside of the Airbnb Empire training. So I won't go through the demo of how to set an ad live here, but I do want to point you to that. It takes you through the basics of what the mechanics are of setting up an ad, including choosing a picture and choosing the words and choosing the audience. And the exact same principles in that training would apply, because it's localized. It would be to a specific area. And you could put some wording together, letting people know what the intention is for the use of your space. So that takes you through really what people are looking for spaces for right now, what your options are for the use of your spaces, and how you can get that message out there. And then I just want to bring this session to a close by talking about what your responsibility is. Your first and most important responsibility is to keep yourself and your family safe during this uncertain time where we're not quite sure exactly the effect of in our own neighborhoods, but we are starting to see the effect certainly on the short-term rental business. And that if you do have a space that you are offering to people, it is your absolute responsibility to make sure that you are thoroughly sanitizing your space. In between guests, I have seen hosts making sure that there's a whole day blocked over between one guest and another, as opposed to the standard 4 hours, to make sure that everything is totally sanitized using an alcohol-based cleaning product or something else equally sturdy. And then for us to stay calm, I find this a really fascinating time that we're living in, and there, yes, absolutely are challenges that we have to rise to and leadership that we have to take. But at the same time, we can only do those things if we take the responsibility to keep ourselves calm. One of the practices that I have in my life is a morning ritual of taking a moment to list a minimum of 3 things that I'm feeling grateful for, and they don't have to be enormous things. They could be as small as, the sip of coffee that I'm having. And I find that a really centering exercise. And then shortly after that, I had listened to a guided mindfulness exercise, which I highly recommend as a habit for yourself. But maybe your version of staying calm It's just noticing whenever you're getting a panicking thought and acknowledging that that thought is there, and then choosing to recognize it for just that, a thought. Or maybe your version is to make sure that you keep your body moving, whether that's on some kind of indoor exercise machine, or if you're distance enough that you could take a walk to your beach or your local forest, or somewhere where you're connecting with nature. But I really want to leave you with the idea that it's super, super important that you prioritize keeping calm in this time, because as a business owner, as an Airbnb owner, it is your responsibility to contribute right now in whatever way that you can. And this kind of reminds me of wartime movies. I'm a big fan of Downton Abbey, and there was a whole season of Downton Abbey during the war where the abbey had to be used as a hospital. And it's not dissimilar to something that we could be facing now. And as a custodian of a space, in a time when isolated spaces are needed, you really have the chance to see the silver lining in that and see how you can position yourself right now in your business to get the message out there of what your space could be used as, and contribute during this time and add value during this time, in a time where we need calm, level-headed business owners who are thinking about how we can work together to solve the challenges that we're faced right now. So that brings me to the end of this emergency, how can we pivot in a time of corona resilience module.